If you're going to talk about violence and right and wrong in that sense, then he told them quite rightly they had the issue backwards.
Which side are you on? Which side are you on?
Even though in historical context, if you look over the last 100 years or so, 2021 wasn't particularly noteworthy, there was certainly a different feel and a different tone in the coverage as workers from coal miners to grad students and factory workers to cereal makers went on strike. A common theme that arose from these strikes was the widespread use of injunctions. If you listen to the show, you know intimately about the struggle that the coal miners in Brookwood have faced with these particularly repressive orders from the state, restricting them to 10 to 11 workers on the picket line at first, and then to 6, then banning the practice altogether. Now, the state has graciously allowed the coal miners in Bessemer, in Brookwood, to have 2 people on the picket line. We're so thankful to the state, to our overlords in the government. John Deere workers and Kellogg's workers also saw this tactic used against them as well. And so I'm watching Striketober unfold, right, like everybody else, and the boss making use of state power to repress protests that can, in almost no case, be called mass pickets. And I thought that it would be interesting to learn more about the history of state repression of the picket, and specifically the repression of mass picketing. My friend Daniel, who is in law school, recommended looking up our next guest, and I was not disappointed. Mr. Ahmed White is a professor of law and the Nicholas Rosenbaum Professor of Law Chair at the University of Colorado. He got his law degree at Yale, and he has been doing a lot of work lately on the history of law and labor relations. He is the author of a book and the author of an upcoming book titled Under the Iron Heel, The Wobblies in the Capitalist War on Radical Workers. Mr. White, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us today.
Thanks for having me. I'm happy to be here.
Great. So a lot of your work focuses on mass picketing as a tactic and its successes and defeat. The injunctions that were issued against working folks last year and are still in effect for our sisters and brothers in Brookwood, they weren't actually responses to anything that could be reasonably be called mass pickets, right?
That's right. I mean, mass pickets or mass picketing is an inherently ambiguous concept. No one has a definite notion of where mass picketing begins or ends, but the instances here were not particularly indicative of that, and that's typical when you get these injunctions. They're actually seldom premised on mass picketing, because mass picketing isn't engaged in very often by workers anymore.
So what is a mass picket then?
Well, again, it's never been perfectly clear what mass picketing is. There's a long history in this country of banning picketing. And until the 1930s, these bans on picketing, often by judges in the form of injunctions, were seldom contested, were usually regarded as perfectly legitimate. In the 1930s, when there was a round of reformist legislation passed in Congress, picketing became, let's say, presumptively legal. When there was, by the 1940s, a kind of concerted backlash against that and against labor rights in general, one of the issues that the enemies of organized labor raised was the specter of mass picketing. And they, meaning people in Congress, including those who ultimately secured the enactment of the Taft-Hartley Act in 1947, never had a clear idea what mass picketing was or wasn't. They figured correctly that if they could ban it in some way or another, the risks of mass picketing and the cost inherent in that ambiguous definition would fall on workers. In other words, if there were doubts whether picketing was mass picketing or not, workers would bear the burdens of that.
I see. So the mass picketing as, how would you define it then? Like in your research, when you're looking at mass picketing, what are the kind of things that you were looking at?
Well, the one factor is just size, but again, that's not reducible to any particular number. It never really has. Under federal law, mass picketing is banned by Section 8B1 of the National Labor Relations Act. There's a kind of interesting story there because the ban there isn't an explicit one. It's implicit. It's a matter of the legislative history and intent, and the courts and the NLRB have taken that for granted. So if you read 8B1, it doesn't say anything about mass picketing. Instead, it talks about unions or their agents acting in a coercive way or interfering with or restraining other workers in their exercise of their right not to be involved in union activity. That's been interpreted as the Congress intended to bar mass picketing. But again, there's no particular number that defines what mass picketing is. Instead, the National Labor Relations Board and the courts enforcing that federal provision tend to look at how coercive or how restraining or how much the protest activity interferes with the right of other workers. It's a very vague and ambiguous concept. Mm-hmm. I think that's how it's intended, and that works to the benefit of employers and their allies.
Right. And that's basically, the quote unquote rights of workers not to engage in union activity. This is more or less the right to cross a picket line that this section of the NLRA is supposed to be protecting. And so that is one way that maybe we can think about mass picketing as differentiated from normal picketing, is that it is more difficult for a worker to actually cross that picket line, like physically, because there's so many people there that you just can't cross it, right?
That's right. Brass tacks, that's what it's about. And if you look at the early cases interpreting this provision, the federal provision, it didn't take much. I mean, the kind of slightest interference with even inconvenience with the right of a scab to cross the line was for some courts quite enough. And that was a big change in a short period of time in federal labor law. When the National Labor Relations Act, the Wagner Act, was first enacted in 1935 and first became effective in the late 1930s, it wasn't difficult to find courts who were, let's just say, far more realistic about this issue and about the realities of picketing and what it took for a picket line to be effective. And therefore, we're not so quick to say just because someone was somewhat inconvenienced that therefore something terrible happened. Now, back then, the issue was whether an employer could fire a striker or a picketer because that person interfered with someone who was crossing the picket line. That's still an issue. But nowadays, after Taft-Hartley, there's also the question of whether the employer or the NLRB ultimately could find that an unfair labor practice had occurred and essentially itself enjoin the picketing.
Mm-hmm. And so I think one of the things that even a lot of the public kind of just accepts is that people should have a right to cross a picket line. People should have, that's something that I think a lot of people and companies should have a right, quote unquote, to operate their business during a strike. How would workers who engaged in mass picketing, who did not allow strike breakers, scabs, to cross the picket line because of their numbers primarily? I mean, it was not, people talk about union thugs, and that was not the primary means by which scabs were prevented from crossing the picket line. It was just that it was physically not possible to do that. And there were also sit-down strikes and things like this. How would workers who did that defend these actions?
Well, you put your finger on something really interesting, and that is the kind of historical function of mass picketing in elevating the labor movement during this crucial period of growth in the 1930s, late 1930s and through the 1940s. Mass picketing was effective, as you mentioned, because of the mere numbers. And usually, heyday of mass picketing, we might call the period in the few years after the end of the Second World War, when there were a great number of strikes, the biggest strike wave in American history by far, with a great number of those strikes involving mass picketing. There was actually very little violence and very, almost no serious violence. And what that reflects is the fact that mass picketing worked not because people were being beaten up, that happened occasionally, but usually because mass picketing signaled to people who would cross a picket line that they shouldn't. Some of them were intimidated, I'm sure. Some of them merely responded to the theater of it all. Was an indication of how many of their fellow workers were on the side of the union, and to them that maybe they should reconsider their thoughts about the underlying issue that provoked the strike. And that's why, when it comes down to it, mass picketing was banned at the federal level with Taft-Hartley. It was very effective at making the union movement a meaningful force in American politics and economics. Without mass picketing, the question is, how can strikes be effective? A strike is a withholding of labor. For some workers in some circumstances, that's enough. But for a lot of American workers, it's not, particularly where employers have a very broad right to bring in replacement workers, either temporary replacements or, if it's an economic strike, of course, permanent replacements. That raises a question: how can you win a strike if you're limited to 2 or 5 or 7 or whatever people on a picket line patrolling in a way that some court has prescribed, or even don't have an injunction? You're worried that if you bring too many people on the picket line, the employer's going to go and file an unfair labor practice charge against you, the National Labor Relations Board.
Right. So we've got about 3 or 4 more minutes on the radio, and then we're going to continue. So, folks, if you're listening to us on the radio, you can find us online. We're on Facebook. We're on YouTube at the Valley Labor Report. You can continue to listen to this conversation that we're having with Professor Ahmed White from the University of Colorado about the history of mass picketing in the United States. And the last thing that I wanted to, and we'll wrap the interview here for the radio, is the injunctions that we saw in 2021. What is the basis for them? Because, like I said, these are not mass pickets. These are not pickets that are preventing people from crossing the picket line. And they still had the state come down and say, too much. What is the deal there?
So that's very interesting, and I think quite important. So what I found in studying the use of injunctions in labor cases is a consistent theme. And that is the ability of the people seeking these injunctions, employers, to premise the injunction on an anticipation of violence and disorder that is often at least far removed from any present indication that there would be violence or disorder. And the courts have consistently accepted that argument. So what you have here is a situation where courts, again, routinely issue these injunctions, and they have for decades now, without there being much proof at all that any kind of trouble is in the offing. It's this anticipation that there would be trouble. And that's been true of the way the NLRB has enforced this Section 8B1, in other words, the federal limitations on mass picketing. But it's also been true, as your question and your introduction to this segment indicates, in the great number of cases where state courts have done what state courts can do, separate from the NLRB, and that is to issue their own injunctions. It's this anticipation of violence and disorder, even when it's not in the offing, even when it's a distant threat, if any threat at all. The one other thing I would say, if we have a moment to say this, is that this all happens in a context where employers or their allies very frequently provoke whatever kind of disorder there may be anyway. And when they do that, they provide themselves with a basis for the issuance of these injunctions and never pay much of a price for it.
I got to say, I am very just excited to even learn about you, honestly. I was telling the rest of the crew here this morning, it's always great to find out new people who are and you're not new, you're just new to me, but experts in this. And, you know, I'm looking at your bio here at the University of Colorado, and it's like right up our alley. So it's going to be fun to dig into some of your research. And before you go, I definitely wanted you to have an opportunity to just share, give us sort of a high level summary of what has been the focus of your research as a professor of law focused on unions. What have you been looking at? And, you know, maybe what are some of the most, what are the things you've studied throughout the past that seem to resonate so much in 2022?
Good question. So my work, I started out writing about criminal law, and I got kind of bored with that. I think that's kind of a dead end field to work on if you're a leftist. I mean, if your critique is just a liberal critique, there's always something to say, and I agree with a lot of what people say. But I gradually got more and more into labor stuff, and my focus has come to be labor repression. The different ways that labor is repressed. And what I've come to see is, or what I've come to understand is something I always knew was true, and that is the kind of inherent bias of the state and the legal system. So most of the work I've done kind of culminates in something like that, the sort of limits of the liberal system of labor rights and the way that contributes to a just kind of comprehensive system of repression, and one that, as you both know, it doesn't bar all kinds of labor protest all the time, but it certainly does bar the most effective kinds of protest all the time. And if I had to sum up everything I've done, that's what it comes down to. And it's interesting because I'm just confirming what I knew to be true when I was 17.
Right. Right. And that's sort of, to think about why Jacob even was looking for you and invited you on the show, because we were watching this happening in Brookwood, and, we know the facts on the ground there. And it's just nice to hear from somebody who has seen this and studied it for a long time and documented how this has been an ongoing pattern. And I think that's important, because sometimes people see the government as sort of this like neutral force that is pushed and pulled in different directions. But, in the case of the labor movement, especially, but I think in a lot of areas, it's very clearly not. I mean, it's very clear what side they're on, and it's not our side. And that's something that we have to deal with, in our organizing. We have to factor that in. And
that's exactly right. I mean, one of the most exasperating things in dealing with, you name it, other academics, especially in law, but other sort of mainstream media people or whoever, is this sense that when the state's against labor, I mean, nobody can deny, unless they're total reactionary, that the state's often on the side of employers. But what's exasperating is how often people want to believe that that's just an exceptional thing. That's an aberration.
Maybe they had a good reason that time, right?
Yeah, it's like,
or maybe that's how it's supposed to be.
Yeah, this isn't something to say on radio, but the best analogy might be to like an abusive partner. Like if the abuse is always there, then this person doesn't love you. You know where they stand. They're fundamentally against you. And I wish people thought that same way about the state and about the legal system. These are not aberrations. These are instances of the state telling you where it really stands.
Right.
And I wish people outside of circles like this one, better understood that.
Right. Well, yeah. So let's, we're not constrained by, breaks or anything like this now. So let's back up a little bit, because you mentioned that the law in the state has consistently banned the most effective sorts of protest and picketing, and mass picketing, for an example, sit down strikes, for an example. So let's illustrate for a bit, and you do that in one of your articles, and I would recommend folks. I mean, it's like it's a scholarly article. The title is "Workers Disarmed," and the link is in the show notes. But it's a fantastic article, and you do that in this article and you lay out how effective mass picketing specifically was for working folks. So can you tell us about its rise as a tactic and illustrate its successfulness for us?
Yeah, so before the 1930s, workers did whatever they could in a context where almost everything they engaged in was presumptively or potentially illegal. That changed in the 30s. But what didn't initially change, in other words, you got this law enacted in 1935 that seemed to protect workers' rights to organize, to engage in protests and collective bargaining. For a couple of years, most big employers just ignored that while trying to get the Supreme Court to declare it unconstitutional. And there's a great story, an important story in American history about how workers responded to that by organizing, by saying, well, we're going to make the law effective. The law isn't giving us rights. We're going to assert those rights and make the law effective. And so that's the story. That's a story of mass picketing, but also of sit-down strikes. And so you had this massive wave of sit-down strikes beginning in late 1936 and through the first half of 1937. And some of my colleagues, Jim Pope and Drew Hansen, have argued persuasively, I think, that this was a major reason that the Wagner Act was found constitutional by the Supreme Court in April of 1937. Anyway, just to answer your question, no sooner that happened than the courts and the police started cracking down on sit-down strikes. And in 1939, the Supreme Court basically ruled sit-down strikes were illegal. They followed that up in 1942 with another case involving some workers striking on a ship that kind of put the nail in the coffin of sit-down strikes. Said sit-down strikes are basically almost categorically illegal. In that context, workers turn more and more to mass picketing as an effective means of asserting labor rights. So the Wagner Act is constitutional, but as we all know, the Wagner Act doesn't give workers a contract. It doesn't compel employers to recognize them unless they've got a majority of workers signed up. So you've still got to be active and effective, and that's where workers turn to mass picketing. And it really blossomed in the early 1940s and into the mid 1940s and late 1940s as an effective tactic. And that's again why the Congress tried to declare it, did essentially declare it unconstitutional in 1947. And in the meantime, state courts were continuing to issue injunctions themselves, banning mass picketing or disruptive picketing or picketing they thought might become disruptive or whatever. And what they were able to do was gradually to get more and more license to do that in a context where initially there was some question whether state courts could still assert their jurisdiction in a world where now you've got a federal labor law that's governing labor relations. There was some question whether state courts' authority to issue injunctions would be preempted by this new federal law. In other words, barred because of the supremacy of the federal government. That was cleared up in the 1940s too, that state courts can issue these injunctions as long as they don't try to meddle with the particulars of the labor law. In other words, as long as they don't try to rewrite, as it were, the Wagner Act and its provisions. As long as their injunctions are focused on order and the threat of violence or interference with public access, as long as they're focused on that, they pretty much have carte blanche to issue injunctions.
Right.
Well, and as you mentioned, it can be based on just their imagining of anticipated threats or violence. It doesn't have to really be concretely tied to any real threats. They don't have to have evidence that, you know, there's troublemakers preparing to make trouble. Just the fear. It seems to be enough to get the courts on their side. And, you know, as you're talking, something that really resonates with me is that in the labor movement, we go back to the 30s, often as kind of the peak of our power and our size, the 30s and immediate, you know, post-war period. And so many of those weapons that we had tactically have been outlawed, from the mass picket to our, you know, sympathy strikes and solidarity strikes. That, I think, has boxed us in as a movement. And there's, I think, been a natural trend to just operate within those legal confines. That it seems, you know, it's kind of a natural thing. We institutionalize, we have official tax status, we have staffers with salaries, and so we got to follow the law. We can't be reckless. And it almost it feels, you know, you brought up abusive relationship earlier as a metaphor. So I'm gonna bring this one up. Feels like we've been domesticated, and you know, had our back broken a little bit, and we have to operate within these very strict confines. So that's a long way of leading me to my question, which would be, given that the mass picket and so many other tactics that we know worked in the past are illegal, should the labor movement be looking at taking the risk of, you know, going outside those small, narrow legal confines, or should we be looking at, are there new tactics that they haven't figured out to ban yet that we need to be really focused on? I just don't know if you have any thoughts there, but I'd be curious to hear it.
Well, I think you raise a crucial question.
I know you are a professor of law, and I don't want you to say anything.
Saying get me in trouble, yeah. But no, you raise a crucial question, and one that I think has to be on the table. What is the value of being legal? And I'm not saying that to say, to endorse engaging in criminal acts or whatever. People have to decide for themselves what they're going to do in this world. But not everything that's illegal is criminal either. And some of my colleagues, a few of my colleagues among law professors, have begun to raise this issue. Like, what's the real value of the NLRB system to workers now? When, as you put it quite correctly, so much of what was effective 70, 80 years ago is illegal now anyway. When the NLRB and NLRA do as much to constrain what workers can do to limit workers' rights and prerogatives as they do to assist workers. And you noted, unions, if they are legitimate, have to have lawyers and staff. I mean, I completely understand that, being a lawyer myself. But one of the problems with that approach is, even to the extent that it works, who has the greater resources to play that game anyway? I mean, there are a lot of great labor lawyers out there. I know them, I respect them.
Yeah.
But legal representation costs a lot of money, a lot of time. Even if it worked perfectly, you're dealing with people, big employers, whose resources are often much, much, much more extensive. They can win that battle often even against the best, most conscientious, most sacrificial of labor lawyers on the union side of things. In terms of new tactics, I mean, I'm starting to get up there in years a little bit, and I don't know what's out there. I just know that since the advent of the internet and then social media, people have been, and the labor side have been waiting for the next new thing, and it's never come. Right. It's never quite come. It was going to be the internet, and then email, and then the various social media platforms were going to replace the old tactics that were no longer effective. And I'm not denigrating those efforts. I'm just saying nothing's been a kind of panacea or the magic bullet yet. And I know there are a lot of really smart and conscientious often young organizers out there, and more power to them. Maybe something will come around and help change things. Just hasn't happened yet.
Right. Well, and the thing that has been the most effective, like you said, has been, withholding our labor and basically not allowing others to contribute their labor, where there are people that want to cross that picket line, and the rise of mass pickets is a tactic. You mentioned in your article that during a 1-year period that formed the core of, quote, American labor's greatest upsurge, there were 4,600 strikes, including some 5 million workers. 2021, Striketober, there were like 300 something strikes and some hundreds of thousands of workers, so, and we have multitudes more people in the country, several more workers, more than 100 million workers in this country. And so the difference there is huge. And when I asked you earlier, like, how did workers justify, because today this property rights and right to go cross a picket line is kind of taken for granted, and I think that was contested back then when workers decided to take this action to say no, like, we don't believe you have a right to cross our picket line. We don't believe that you have a right to work here while we are striking. Do you think that there was that they spent a whole lot of time philosophically and morally thinking through these things, and that there was a really sturdy justification in their minds, or that they just recognized that this was power, and it was more of a tactical calculation or a philosophical justification that they had in their minds? What do you think was going on when people did this?
Oh, a little of both. I mean, depending on who was involved. I mean, I think for people on the left wing of the labor movement, there was an attempt to ground this in leftist politics and philosophy. Whether you're talking about sort of IWW syndicalist or even kind of Communist Party types in the 1930s and 1940s, I think for the mainstream of the labor movement, it was largely a practical thing, but not entirely. I mean, if you look at, and I say a little bit about this in the article you mentioned, if you look at the legislative history of the Taft-Hartley Act, when a number of these union people went and testified in Congress, some of them did make an effort to justify mass picketing, and it did seem at least somewhat earnest. You had Walter Reuther, who was, no radical, certainly not by 1947, basically reminding people in Congress that if you're going to talk about this issue in terms of violence and right and wrong in that sense, then he told them quite rightly they had the issue backwards. He said, let me remind you who, in so many words, he said, let me remind you who was doing the beating and the killing of people in this country. Not very long ago was, I think, the phrase he used, and quite rightly, in the 1930s scores, probably a couple of hundred people altogether were killed in labor disputes, and the vast majority of them were on the union side. And
Right.
the president of the Communications Workers Union, who was even further to the right, much more of a conventional trade unionist than Ruther, said something really interesting to Congress when they were debating mass picketing. He refused to condemn it. So Republican congressmen were trying to box him in and say, we want you to condemn mass picketing. And he kept refusing to do it. And finally, kind of exasperated, he said something like, he said, I'm not going to sympathize. In so many words, he said, I'm not going to sympathize with a guy who is trying to cross the picket line. That's what you're trying to get me to do. He said, that guy is like the guy who won't obey the traffic rules, who decides that the red light is for other people and not for him. And I thought that was really interesting because that put a finger on something fundamental. Labor and labor rights are about solidarity. They don't work without solidarity. And this idea that was consecrated with Taft-Hartley, the right of dissidents, essentially of scabs, placement workers, whoever, freeloaders, not to go along with the union, is entirely antithetical to the very thing that is at the core of a functional labor movement, this business of solidarity. And this guy, Bill Burney, who was the president of the Communications Workers Union, he understood that. And I think everyone on some level in the labor movement back then understood that.
Well, and I think that there's a certain amount of maybe a belief that labor has a certain amount of democratic rights in the workplace, in the same way that, the traffic lights that he mentioned, there aren't traffic light trees that we have to obey by some natural law. They arise from ostensibly, ideally, democratic processes of electing governments and governments executing laws and city ordinances and things like this. And we have a democratic right to bind our neighbors to certain standards and to certain, and we have a right democratically to say that when this light is red, you can't go. And I think that workers have a democratic right to say that, when the light is red, you can't go. You can't. And the picket line is a red light. The picket line's a red light. And when workers say democratically that there's a red light here, I think that is. I don't think that even today union members see. I don't think that they conceive of it in that way, and that they believe it has as much legitimacy as it ought to.
Mm-hmm. No, I think that is a great point, a tremendously important point. I mentioned a few minutes ago my friend and colleague Jim Pope. He's a law professor, just retired at Rutgers, and Jim wrote just a fascinating and very important article. Maybe a couple of decades ago about the sit-down strikes called Worker Lawmaking. I forget the journal it's in. But what Jim argued, I think this is just absolutely crucial. He looked at the history of these sit-down strikes, and he made, I think, the essential point that you have to look at what those workers were doing in those sit-down strikes as an exercise in lawmaking. Not just any legal thing they were doing, which is the conventional way of seeing, they were violating the rights of private property and trespass and all of that. Jim said, no, look at them and look at the way they understood themselves what they were doing. They were trying to assert a different understanding of what the law meant or should mean, and one that was not any the less legitimate than the kinds of notions of private property or trespass that were being used against them. And you could say the very same thing about something like mass picketing, that workers have a prerogative, and to some extent back in the day they did, try to assert their notion of what is legitimate, what is disorderly, what is coercive? What is interfering with a person's right to go to work? What does the right to work even really mean? And I think if workers could recapture that, I'm not saying that's easy or that I have some program, but I think if workers could recapture that kind of spirit, it would go a long way towards revitalizing the labor movement. Again, it's not easy because you can end up in jail doing this, or God forbid, seriously injured or killed on a picket line. That happened all the time 70, 80, 90 years ago. But if workers could recapture that spirit, it would go a long way towards rebuilding the labor movement.
Wow, I think there's a lot that y'all just discussed there that to me speaks to the social contract in the way in which, to the extent that we even have a social contract anymore that anyone could pinpoint, it's certainly been, I think, individualized and much less of a collective nature than it was 70, 80 years ago in the time period we're talking about. And another thing that you mentioned that I think is a major, difference between now and then was that there was a left. There was such a thing as the left, and it was, such a monumental part of the labor movement. And, as mass pickets and other tactics were outlawed, the left itself was purged from the labor movement. And, we've yet to recover from that. So I think those are some of the things that, if you look at these trends historically over the past 7-8 decades, we had our major weapons taken away. We had some of the, the most, let's see, energetic, perhaps, factions of the movement taken away by the purging of the left. And I think all those things have, again, go back to like the domestication piece of how the movement has changed from a militant and radical social movement that was, as you described and your colleague described, making its own law, essentially, to now much more institutionalized, much more dependent on, playing within the rules that are certainly not written for us or by us, but are for us to abide or else. Those we could probably talk about this all day, but it just those were some things that stuck out to me, and definitely we'll be looking up Jim Pope from Rutgers as well. Yeah. So, Professor, you're teaching us. I don't know how your week went, but at least on today, Saturday, you can be assured you taught some folks today.
Yeah, I was telling when Daniel suggested you, and I found you, it's like you couldn't have created somebody who's doing work more precisely about what I wanted to talk about. And so, these tactics effectiveness, there was a really strong, we've hit on some of the backlash to that, but there was a really strong incentive to undercut and delegitimize and push back against these tactics, either by hook or by crook, right?
Yes, most definitely. I mean, this was quite well organized. I think if I get your question right, if you look at the opposition to not just labor rights in general, but effective forms of labor protest, it was not only organized; it was well organized, and you could see that in the way it changed in reaction to different circumstances. So initially, when the Wagner Act was passed, the big employers' response was, we're gonna ignore this. This will go away. The Supreme Court had invalidated essentially most of the first New Deal. They'll invalidate this, and we'll pay some lawyers to bring that about. That failed. They changed their strategy almost overnight. The strategy was, okay, we'll get the Wagner Act repealed. And they spent the next decade from about 37 to 47 first trying to get it repealed. They saw that wasn't going to go anywhere. So then they thought, well, we don't have to get it repealed. We'll just get it amended. this will work to our advantage. And that gave rise to Taft-Hartley. And then I think for a couple of decades, they were more or less resigned to labor rights, to some level of functional labor rights. But as we all know, by the 1970s and 1980s, they changed their perspective again. And they said, what we'll do now is destroy the labor movement. And they have all but done that. If you look at union representation, it was organized at every level around the big employer associations, the Chamber of Commerce, the National Association of Manufacturers, the Business Roundtable, the big industry groups, the Iron and Steel Institute. It's amazing how well organized this always was.
In the state legislatures in DC and like I said, by hook or by crook, one of the things that you mentioned in the article, and I'll quote a bit here. Besides giving rise to the Memorial Day massacre mentioned at the outset of this article, clashes between SWOC picketers and police, company agents, and National Guardsmen left at least 6 and possibly 8 unionists dead and well over 300 people injured in Michigan, Ohio, and Pennsylvania. And there's not a single instance of quote-unquote union violence that looks like that. That's just not something that happens on the other side. And so you've got this assault on working people's rights to picket and to even exist as a union, as an organization all across the country. And so and like you said, that leaves us today with with a situation where state judges in Tuscaloosa can say, people got their feelings hurt and they had feelings about fear or something. And so now we're going to limit the picket line to 2 people. When did as soon as mass picketing started becoming like de facto illegal, did we immediately see the anticipation of violence or intimidation or coercion used as a justification for these injunctions? Or did it take a little bit of time to get to where we are today?
It took some time, but one of the ironies here is that if you plotted out the serious violence, the rate of serious violence in labor relations in the United States, it remained quite high through the mid and late 1930s, and then it began to fall, and it fell dramatically. So only a relatively small number of people have been killed in labor disputes since the end of the Second World War. But what that did, and this is the irony of it, because of course no one's in favor of people getting seriously hurt or killed. But the irony here is that the threshold of what was tolerable in terms of violence has steadily ratcheted, or not just violence, but unrest has steadily ratcheted downward. So you can find even in Supreme Court opinions, you mentioned the violence, quoting from the article of mine, violence in what was called the Little Steel Strike in 1937, where about 16 or 18 people were killed in different clashes. In the wake of that strike, you can find a U.S. Supreme Court opinion where the Supreme Court said, basically, if the labor law is going to function, the people administering it, including the courts, have to understand that there's going to be a certain level of disorder and a certain level of violence. And the court wasn't saying, it's a case about whether these strikers were entitled to be reinstated after this big strike. And the court validated the NLRB's ruling that most all of them had a right to be reinstated, even though the employers were saying they were the authors of violence. As you point out, the workers in the strike hadn't killed anybody. It was the employers and their agents and police who had killed 16, 18 people. Anyway, the Supreme Court said, look, you can't just say that workers involved in a strike that's violent are not entitled to be reinstated. Yeah, if someone tried to kill another person, that person is disentitled to reinstatement. But just because they were involved in a picket line fracas doesn't mean that the employer can deny them employment. That was in 1940 when the Supreme Court decided this case. As time has passed here. The threshold for the courts of what is intolerable disorder, what is sufficiently threatening of violence, has diminished further and further and further and further until you get kind of absurd things. You and I, Jacob, were talking about this earlier. The injunction issued here in Colorado against the King Soopers, the Kroger's picketers. I read the injunction and the claims that it was premised on, and they were absurd. Someone playing loud music in the store. Some people were, an epithet was supposedly, 8,000 people out on strike, and an epithet was supposedly, we don't know if that even happened. We don't know what the epithet was. The threshold of what is intolerable has worked its way so far downward now. As you've noted several times, quite rightly, that is the underpinning of so many of these devastating restrictions on picketing.
Right.
It's interesting to hear you describe that in terms of the Colorado pickets, because, I'm thinking back to my time as a high school teacher. And, if maybe managers at Kroger or the courts had ever just visited a high school hallway, they're going to hear more than one. They may hear some bad language and some yelling and some loud music and, folks being a little bit rowdy.
Yeah, good grief.
So maybe I'm biased. I am biased, but my guess is that picket line was no rowdier than most anywhere in our state on a Saturday in the fall during college football season. So it is absurd. But something that you mentioned about that Supreme Court ruling back in 1940 is that it seems to me that even justices of the Supreme Court, clearly, the elite of the elite had some recognition that there was conflict between employer and employee. I'm not saying that they were admitting that Marx was right. We have a bourgeoisie versus proletariat driving history. But, it seems like there was, among all sides, more of a understanding that there was contradiction there and there was conflict there. And in the 80 years since, it seems like we have done everything we can as a society and through media and culture to sort of mystify that contradiction and conflict and erase it from consciousness.
Oh, absolutely. If you look, there's an interesting kind of backstory here. The Supreme Court wasn't, in the late 30s and early 40s uniformly on labor side, as we know, but it was occasionally. And at the forefront of that, in the lead on the court, were some interesting figures. One of them was Alabama's own Hugo Black. You also had William O. Douglas, and then maybe the most fascinating of those people was a guy named Frank Murphy, who was the governor of Michigan during the big sit-down strikes, including the big GM sit-down strike in Flint in the winter of 36, 37. And he distinguished himself by he called out the National Guard, but he refused to unleash them on the sit-down strikers, and that abetted the UAW strikers in winning that strike. And then a few years later, he ends up on the Supreme Court, partly because his actions during that strike cost him the governorship in Michigan. And so Roosevelt put him on the Supreme Court. But these things are sort of interconnected in interesting ways. He was then the author of a case called Thornhill versus Alabama in 1940, which was the high water mark in the Supreme Court ruling that picketing was protected under the First Amendment of the U.S. Constitution. Until that decision, it was not clear that people had a constitutional right to picket. And then this guy, Frank Murphy, authored the Supreme Court decision that said, yes, you absolutely do have a First Amendment right to engage in picketing. It was a labor case out of Tuscaloosa. And then every case after that the Supreme Court, just about every case after Thornhill that the Supreme Court decided on picketing, eroded that right, limited that right further. So there's some interesting interconnections there, and they rest on the fact that in a lot of ways, we think of progress as a kind of linear thing. In a lot of ways, the Supreme Court, some of these Supreme Court justices were further to the left, way further to the left, especially on labor issues back in the 1930s and 40s, than anybody you'll find on the court today.
Yeah, and I was not familiar with that Alabama connection, so that's really cool. Appreciate you sharing that.
So, Professor White, I really, really appreciate your time. This has just been this has been fantastic. Exactly what I was looking for. Was there anything that you wanted to make sure that you mentioned before we wrapped up our conversation?
I can't think of anything. The main thing is just to thank you all for having me. It's been my pleasure.
What is you've got a book coming out in the next year or so, but you have a book already, and I'm planning on reading it. It's called "The Last Great Strike: Little Steel, the CIO, and the Struggle for Labor Rights in New Deal America." University of California Press, 2016. Folks can check out that. Folks can check out your scholarly articles. Fantastic stuff there. And the new book that you've got coming out. You said it's in October. Is when you're expecting it to be released?
Should be out in October. Yep.
Under the Iron Heel: The Wobblies and the Capitalist War on Radical Workers. We will hope to have you on again. Thank you for being so generous with your time. Absolutely. And have a great Saturday. Okay. You just saw a clip from the Valley Labor Report. We are live every Saturday morning from 9:30 a.m. till 12:30 p.m. And we pride ourselves on keeping all of our content free to everybody so that we can talk to as many working folks as possible. If you support the work that we're doing, you think that it's important, you think that it's good, then consider making a monthly contribution to the project, and you can do that on our website, tvlr.fm.